Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. If you've watched any of my other videos, you're probably well aware that I love a good index fund. They are some of my absolute favorite investment vehicles. They give you instant diversification, they're tax efficient, they have low cost fees, they're highly liquid, meaning they're easy to buy and sell, and they have a solid track record of good returns. What's not to like about that? I think index funds have really changed the landscape of investing and have made the stock market accessible to the everyday person. Prior to the arrival of index funds, you either had to pick stocks, which is not always the easiest thing to do, or rely on mutual funds, which often have really high entry costs, high exit costs, and high carrying costs. And nowadays, index funds are wildly popular. Investors have 1,732 index funds to choose from, and investors have over $2 trillion invested in these index funds. So I thought it'd be a fun idea to do a video on my all-time favorite index funds, ones that if you bought them, you could hold them for the rest of your life. Now keep in mind, everyone does have a different investing style, so certain funds may be more or less appealing based on your preferences, your stage of life, or really any other factor. And I'm going to be doing this list in ascending order, working up to my absolute favorite. Number 5, the Vanguard Russell 2000 Index Fund, ticker symbol VRTIX, and Fidelity Small Cap Index Fund, VSSNX. Now here we have a tie between Vanguard and Fidelity, which you're going to notice a few times on this list. The fact of the matter is both of these companies offer up really great low-cost index funds, and often they offer up identical versions of these funds. So which company you go with often really just comes down to personal preference. Now, if you haven't heard of the Russell 2000, it is a collection of the 2,000 smallest companies on the stock market as weighted by their capitalization. I'm sure you're familiar with the S&P 500. That is a collection of the 500 largest companies listed on the stock market. So this is literally just on the other side of the spectrum as that. Now, why might small cap stocks be appealing? Well, the fact of the matter is they have more potential for upside. Larger companies are unlikely to double, triple, or quadruple in size because they're already multi-trillion-dollar companies. Smaller companies do have this flexibility to still grow because they are comparatively smaller. And also, smaller companies are more nimble and capable of reacting to marketplace changes more quickly. I like to use the analogy of boats. It's far more easy to turn a powerboat than it is to, say, turn a cruise liner. The Fidelity Small Cap Index Fund has an expense ratio of 0.025%, meaning for every $10,000 you invest, it'll cost you $2.50 per year. This fund comes with a $0 initial investment, and the fund's average 10-year performance is 13.38%. Number 4, the Vanguard Real Estate Index Fund, VGSLX. Real estate can be a really appealing investment, but let's face it, not everyone wants to buy a fixer-upper and spend their weekends doing home repairs, and not everyone wants to be a landlord. So if you fall in either of these two categories, maybe you'd be interested in a real estate index fund. The Vanguard Real Estate Investment Trust, or REIT, allows you to take part ownership in hotels, office spaces, or other real estate holdings without actually having to deal with the day-to-day management. And it's important to note that REITs are obligated to pay out 90% of their profits to their shareholders, so you can count on receiving a regular dividend. It's also worth noting that these are very narrow scope index funds, meaning that they are sector specific, so inherently they will come with greater risk. This fund has an expense ratio of 0.12%, so for every $10,000 you have invested, it will cost you $12 a year. So significantly less than any home repair, and it does have a minimum investment of $3,000 to get started. The 10-year average return for this fund is 11.51%. But if you were invested in this fund when the real estate market went totally gangbusters this past year, you captured over a 40% return. How incredible is that? Now, it's very unlikely that that is going to be a long-term metric. It's far more reliable to use that 10-year average, but it's still pretty amazing to see. Number 3, the Shelton NASDAQ 100 Index Direct, ticker symbol NASDX, and Investco QQQ ETF. The most well-known indexes that track market performance are the S&P 500, the Dow Jones, and the NASDAQ. As stated before, the S&P 500 is simply a collection of the 500 largest companies based on market capitalization. The Dow Jones is a collection of just 30 companies. The companies on this list are actually rated on both qualitative and quantitative factors. They have to meet certain metrics and they have to have a certain reputation. So these are going to be your blue chip companies. Then we have the NASDAQ. This is a collection of 3,000 stocks. They have to be listed on the NASDAQ stock exchange, and they are heavily weighted towards the tech sector. So the stocks on this index fund are going to be heavily weighted towards the tech sector. So which index is best? Well, it depends on what your investment goals are. The S&P 500 is going to be more reflective of the overall market performance. The Dow Jones is going to be less volatile. These are more of your tried and true companies. And the NASDAQ, again, is going to lean more towards that tech sector. Now, I love the tech sector. That's why this index fund and this ETF are on the list. But unfortunately, Vanguard does not offer an index fund that directly tracks the NASDAQ. Otherwise, I'm sure I would have bought it, and I'm sure it would have been on this list. The Shelton NASDAQ Fund was founded in January of 2000. It has an expense ratio of 0.5%, which means for every $10,000 you have invested, it will cost you $50, and has a 10-year return of 22.04%. I do have an ETF included on this list, QQQ, and I know this is a list about index funds, but quite frankly, ETFs and index funds have a lot of similarities, and this is an ETF that I personally invest in. The expense ratio is 0.2%, so it costs you $20 for every $10,000 you have invested, and has a 10-year average return rate of 22.53%. We will take a little pause in our list here to check out today's video sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community where millions come together to take the next step in their creative journey, with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people on topics including finance, illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more. I've been committing to completing one course per month, and thus far I've taken classes on productivity and improving communication, and I've just started a course on iPhone photography. I love that there are so many different course options, all presented ad-free, so there are no distractions. Ones that can help me in my career, as well as exploring my personal interests. I recently interviewed for a new position, and the interviewer said to me, "You seem quite unflappable." And to me, that was such a high compliment, and I certainly attribute it to my continuing dedication to improving my communication skills. And I've always wanted to take amazing pictures, but let's face it, I'm not gonna carry a camera around with me. So that's why I enrolled in the iPhone photography course. My husband and I travel to some pretty amazing places, and it would be really nice to capture those moments, and hopefully I can start to decorate some of my walls. And let's face it, I'm always on the quest to take the perfect picture of Peanut. If you're interested in exploring your more creative side, the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare so you can start exploring your creativity today. Number 2, the Vanguard 500 Index Fund, VFIAX, and the Fidelity 500 Index Fund, FXAIX. Another tie between Vanguard and Fidelity. The S&P 500 is the most well-known index for tracking the stock market, and these funds simply hold whatever the S&P 500 holds, and in those exact proportions. They simply mimic the index. Their holdings are identical. The Vanguard S&P 500 fund has an expense ratio of 0.04%, which translates to $4 for every $10,000 you have invested. It also has an initial minimum investment of $3,000 and a 10-year average return of 16.51%. I know that initial $3,000 lump sum can be a bit of a hurdle for those investors just starting out, but it is important to note that if your company keeps their retirement plan with Vanguard, like their 403b, the 401k, or a simple IRA, you can choose any of the Vanguard funds and that initial minimum is waived. So that's just something to bear in mind. But if you're investing on your own and not through a company and you're struggling to come up with that initial investment, you can always just go with Fidelity. The Fidelity S&P 500 fund has an expense ratio of 0.015%, meaning for every $10,000 you have invested, they will charge $1.50. They also have a $0 minimum startup investment, and the fund has an average 10-year rate of return of 16.54%. And number 1, the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund, ticker symbol VTSAX, and the Fidelity Total Stock Market Index Fund, FZROX. Another tie between Vanguard and Fidelity. I told you it was going to be a theme. The holdings of many Vanguard index funds as well as many Fidelity index funds are identical, but I do think in recent years Fidelity has kind of inched forward with some of their index funds having a 0% expense ratio and a $0 initial minimum investment. Now, those zeros are actually very appealing to many investors. It is worth noting that the transaction costs for these index funds are going to be passed along to you as an investor in one way or another, so they're not technically zero, but they're as close as you can get. If I were just starting out today as an investor, I might be more inclined to go with Fidelity with this $0 minimum requirement and the 0% expense ratio. Personally, I do invest with Vanguard, but I've been investing for many years. These Fidelity Zero funds actually only came along in 2018, so they are relatively new, but they are a great option for new investors just getting started. Now, I love the Total Stock Market Fund. It literally holds every single stock. Big companies, small companies, and everything in between. Tech sector, healthcare, consumer staples, everything. They literally are reflective of the entire stock market as a whole. I love the idea of investing in the entire economy, and that is why this is my number 1 pick. And just like with those funds that track the S&P 500, in this fund, stocks are held in the same proportion in which they make up their market share. So the bigger companies, think Apple and Microsoft and Google, are held in larger proportions. Smaller companies are held in smaller proportions. The Vanguard Total Stock Market Fund has an expense ratio of 0.04%, meaning you will pay $4 for every $10,000 you have invested, and the traditional minimum investment requirement of $3,000. The 10-year average return is 16.29%. The Fidelity Total Stock Market Fund has an expense ratio of 0%. Keep in mind that those transaction costs will be passed along to you as an investor in one way or another, and a $0 initial minimum investment. Now, there is no 10-year average available for this fund, being that it was established in 2018. But the Fidelity Total Stock Market Index Fund non-zero variety has a 10-year average return of 16.25%. So we can use that as a reference point. So those are my favorite index funds, ones that if you own them, you can own them for life. Do you have any that you would add to the list? Let me know in the comments down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing, as it really does help the channel. I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you soon. Bye.